Okay, thank you all for coming, especially Tuesday after a bank holiday weekend. My talk is about working time, but it's not just about hours of work, about 9 to 5 days of work, Monday to Friday, but it's also about temple culture and about normative understandings of working time and moral values about working time. So not working time just as things, but how we think about working time. The sociologist Barbara Adams speaks about the clock time of industrial society as a type of temporal hegemony. By this she means that clock time became the time that measured all times. So in this paper I'm going to talk about how time is experienced and organised in new ways in knowledge workplaces. In these workplaces, time is unpredictable, it's social, it's networked, and it's contested. In industrial society, clock time and work time were synonymous. In knowledge workplaces, this connection has been broken. I'm talking about a working time culture that's framed by unpredictability. And this unpredictability means that we have changing expectations of work and non-work time. It's an understanding of non-work time that reverses the clear boundaries between the two that was very characteristic of industrial time. It's a rationality which views non-work time not as separate and distinct, but as an optional resource to be drawn on when required. So non-work time becomes emergency work time. So in the book I argue that what we have increasingly is a temporal culture that is framed by unpredictability, whereas in industrial society the culture was very much framed by regularity. And when we have that, we can recognise when we have that culture, when we see a couple of temporal understandings, different ways of thinking and talking about time. Firstly, when we see a public commitment to long hours in the work. Secondly, when we see non-work time becomes classified as emergency work time. And thirdly, when you've got blurred boundaries between work and non-work, and you've got porous time. So in the first part of the talk, I'm going to give a brief overview of working time arrangements in Europe. And the takeaway point of that is there's a lot of variability between countries, but despite this, it's very clear that there is a standard working time that is very persistent, that it's within most countries, working time is regular. Most people work Monday to Friday. Most people work the same number of hours. This persistence of the standard has meant that most debates about working time are framed around issues of long days or short days, typical working times or atypical working times. A certain amount of regularity is assumed. And because of this framing, work-life balance conflict is often considered either in terms of long hours, with shorter hours being the solution, or antisocial hours, with limiting antisocial hours or remunerating them being the solution. But if we look again at survey data, we see there's something else happening, and that for a very significant section of the population, working time is unpredictable. So taking that observation as a starting point, I move from the macro to the micro, from the European Working Conditions Survey statistics to an ethnography of working time within the software sector. So in the second part of the speech, I look at understandings of working hours and how our hours are experienced. And here we can see how labour processes and work organisation shape temporal culture. And it's here we can see how temporal culture, at least within these workplaces, has changed. There is a famous E.P. Thompson historian quotation about the development of working time struggles. And he said, "The first generation of factory workers were taught by their masters the importance of time. The second generation formed their short time committees in the 10-hour movement. The third generation struck for overtime or time and a half. They had accepted the category of their employers and learned to fight back within them. They had learnt their lesson that time is money only too well." So bit by bit he argues that time discipline became internalised. So firstly, the workers had to learn to turn up on time. Secondly, they had to accept that they must turn up on time but argue how long that time should be. That is, firstly they struggle against time, then they begin to struggle not against time but about time. And thirdly, they accept they must turn up on time and for how long it is, and now they argue for how much their time is worth. So initially, external pressures forced time discipline if you didn't turn up to work, you could get beaten, you could be fined, you could lose your job. Protestant preachers preached against sloth as a laziness became a sin. Schools were seen as very important in training in the habit of industry. Fairs and sports and carnivals, which disrupted the working week, were suppressed. So over time, there was an internalization of this time discipline, so that so people would automatically know that they had to turn up and what their hours were. So in the next section of the paper, I look at how in this post-industrial society, how temporal struggles are unfolding. And I find that, as to be expected, time is still contested, but that the nature of these of work time and the contention occurs in private and not in public. So there's a conflict between the public understanding and the public temporal culture and the private action practices. So we'll start with the first part. So the persistence of standard working time. So if you look in the literature, often the question being asked is, has there been an increase in flexible working time? But flexibility in itself is a very messy umbrella term that covers a huge range of different working time arrangements. So in the main, the flexibility that is in question varies, in this paper, varies around two dimensions: flexibility in the length of the working day and flexibility in the arrangement of working time. There's a third dimension, which I don't get to go into here, which is flexibility in your working life and flexibility in work in contracts. So most of those debates question some aspect of whether we're moving from a standardized working time to a destandardized working time. So with flexibility in the length of the working day, the concern is whether hours of work are increasing or decreasing, whether the hours for full-time workers are changing, and whether the proportion of part-time workers in society is growing or decreasing. And over the course of a year, you can have measures like annualized hours and time banking, which can lead to seasonal variations in the working day. So if you look at European states, you can see national differences are evident in the various degrees of polarization between those working standard hours and those who are working hours outside the standard. In general, on one pole, the standard working day is very prevalent, particularly in the new EU working states. You do have another extreme, such as you can find in the UK, where no standard exists. And I think it's important to note that, because a lot of time within sociology we draw on UK studies. The UK experience is not necessarily typical for what's happening in Ireland and the rest of Europe. They have a very destandardised working time. Within those two extremes, the very standard and the very unstandard, European states vary. Often there is a standard that encompasses most workers, and that would vary from country to country. So, for example, in France, most people work between 31 to 35 hours a week, whereas in Denmark, most work 37 hours a week. However, in some countries, there's an additional standard, which is a short-hour standard, which reflects high rates of part-time working, such as in the Netherlands, where you have a high number of people working 20 hours a week. And in some countries, you would have an additional standard, which is a long-hour standard, such as in France, where you have a smaller peak of people working around 38 or 39 hours. But the bottom line is, between most countries, it's possible to identify working hours duration that can be seen standard, the UK being an exception. So standard working time still exists. The second type of flexibility is flexibility in the arrangement of work. That is, increasing variations in when people are working. So are they still working your standard daylight weekly hours, 9 to 5? Or are hours working into the evening, into the weekends, into the early morning? And there's very little evidence that working hours are increasing to the extent that we have a 24-hour society. Though it should be noted that there are atypical working arrangements in place for a significant proportion of European workers. More than half of all workers work at least one Saturday per month, and almost a third work long days of 10 hours or more, at least once a month. Sunday work is increasing slightly, as is shift work. Less people are working on Saturdays than they did 10 years ago, but slightly more are working Sundays or engaged in shift work. So we're not living a 24-hour society, but you can see there are some pressures towards atypical working. When we look at overall at the working time arrangements, we can find that standard working time is surprisingly robust, but it's not as prevalent as it was in the past. Within most European countries, there's still a national norm as to what those degrees are and when they're worked, but there's also a significant proportion of workers who aren't working standard hours. And this is a very useful paper written by Sean Aileen out in Maynooth University, and it's available. It's a working paper available on the Maynooth University Social Science Institute website. And what they did is they looked at the different clustering of working time arrangements within the EU to show the variety of arrangements that were available and which countries, besides standard working time, what other arrangements were available and which countries had more prevalent ones. But looking at this, you can see that in most of the European countries, the standard is still prevalent, but depending on the country, there is still a significant proportion of workers who have some sort of flexible working time arrangement. So, although the persistence of standard working time is there, we shouldn't assume that there is no change. Certainly, when we look at particular occupations and certain sectors and certain countries, we can see evidence that standard working time is being eroded. So if we just look at the length of the working day and the arrangement of hours, we also miss a new pressure on standard working time. We miss the replacement of regular working hours with irregular, the move from predictable working time to unpredictable. And we miss a change to the temporal culture of working life, the increasing insertion and acceptance of unpredictability as a new standard for those working time structures that were previously considered regular. Some of this is because surveys are understandably biased in favour of measuring regularity, so they tend to underestimate irregularity. So I presume that most people here filled in the last census. And one of the questions, one of the time questions was about commuting to work, and it said, what is your normal hour for leaving work? And it had bands of leaving work. Now, I work in Maynooth University some days, and I work in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin some days. So some days my commute is an hour, and some days it's 20 minutes. So I don't have a regular time to leave work. So it wasn't really possible for me to correctly answer that question because it assumed a certain amount of regularity. And saying in the European Working Conditions Survey, often the questions are framed, what is your usual, what is your normal, what did you do last week? And those can sometimes miss the variability that occurs. Happily, however, there are a few measures that are very useful for us. And these do show that unpredictability is experienced by a sizable number of European workplaces. So they asked about, do you work the same numbers of hours every day? Do you work the same numbers of hours every week? Do you have the same fixed starting and finishing times? So in 2010, just over 42% of European workers did not work the same hours every day. Just almost a third did not work the same hours every week. And 38% did not have fixed starting and finishing times. On-call time can also be considered a type of unpredictable working time. And 20% of Europeans workers have on-call time. A similar percentage do not work the same number of days every week. So we can also look at unpredictability when we think about the time that's normally defined as non-working time and it becomes occupied by work. So one of the questions in the European Working Conditions Survey is how often do employees work in their free time to meet work demands? Unfortunately, they changed the way that question was answered between 2010 and 2015, which makes direct comparison difficult, but the new framing's better. So in 2010, 15% of people surveyed worked in their free time at least once a week. For another 15%, this happened once or twice a month, and a third of their employees spent some free time each month at work. In the early results from the 2015 survey indicate that 45%, it's almost half, it's quite a number, had worked some time in their free time in the last year, and 13% were doing it several times a month. The European Foundation has developed an index of regularity, which shows that 43% of workers have highly regular working hours and arrangements, 28% have medium regularity, and 30% have low regularity. So I think what we can take from this is, despite the robustness of standard time, it's fair to say that a significant proportion of the European working population are not working regular hours. And a survey of Australian working time also reported that almost 20% of respondents had unpredictable daily working hours and 25% had unpredictable weekly working hours. The increased use of zero-hour contracts is perhaps the most visible manifestation of this change, and certainly is the one that's captured the headlines in Ireland and other countries, but it's not the only one. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on knowledge workers and shift the gear to ethnography and qualitative understandings of working time. I actually remember I should have picked this, but here we are. I'll talk about the rest, you can see it. So in the research, I looked at the lived experience of software sector workers in Ireland. I picked the software sector because it's a sector in which working time is relatively unregulated. It's become increasingly bound to rapidly changing financial markets. It's a sector where workers employ high levels of temporal autonomy and control over their work processes, and are engaged in work processes which are open-ended. The workers I spoke to were all engaged in different occupations within the sector, but all were knowledge workers, and that these workers were workers with thinking skills who identify and solve problems by manipulating symbols and ideas. So when I was doing the research, I was coming home in a taxi, and I had a conversation with the driver about the computer programmers. And he said, I'd pick them up at all hours, 7, 8, 9, all hours. And that conversation speaks to a very common understanding, which is that computer workers work long hours. And that's a very popular narrative that stretches from Dublin to Dubai to Silicon Valley. Laszlo Block, who's the head of HR at Google, promoted recently his new book, Work Rules, explained that his motivation for working the book was nobody works 40 hours anymore, so it was necessary to work out how to make work better because it takes over life. When I was doing the research, however, the first unexpected finding I had, that is if we look beyond the reputation and the self-presentation of the software sector, we find that not everybody works long hours. I asked the software workers to fill in diaries indicating when they started work, when they finished work, when they took breaks. And I found that the average hours worked in the week was 40 hours, slightly above the national average at the time, which was 38 hours. But the largest category of workers work standard hours, work between 35 to 39 hours. And only a quarter of the weeks worked were very long hours, 40 to 45 hours. While only 40, yeah?
How many of the software workers filled out the surveys?
Oh, well, I mean, it's quite a small group because it was mostly a qualitative study, so it was about, I think there was 20, and I got a very good, I mean, I think almost all of them filled it out. What I did is I made them using a postcard that was folded in half, so you could fit them into a jeans pocket, so it was something they could fit in by hand, and I think that made it much easier. And the second reason is, what I did, instead of interviewing them once, I interviewed them 3 times over the course of the year. So I would interview them, they would fill in the diary for a week, and then I would follow it up with an interview, and then at a different time they would fill the diary for a week and I would follow them up for an interview. And I would use the diary as a basis for the interview, so I would ask them to reflect, you said you worked at that time. And I think because there was that conversation with me about the diary, that they were more motivated to fill it in, because they knew it was going to be coming up and they were going to be talking about it. So they filled in the diaries at different times of the year to capture the different types of times. So it was like one was in autumn, one was around the Christmas period, one was around the summer. So what I found is that it was a sector in which the long hours were prevalent but not dominated. And long hours definitely existed for some, but they were definitely not the norm. And that Irish experience in which a sizable minority works more than 40 hours a week while a majority works standard hours is mirrored in other European countries. If you look at working hours in Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany and UK, you also find that a proportion of employees work very long hours, but a portion do not. And while in Finland, working hours are even closer to the national average, with 69% of employees working between 35 to 39 hours a week. So whether or not individuals felt that their employers expected them to work long hours or not, they were always aware that long hours was part and parcel of working within the industry, even if they themselves weren't working in it. The results of this is that those who were working long hours often saw themselves as the rule rather than the exception within the industry, and vice versa. So there was an incorrect perception colouring the attitudes of the workers and informing their actions. Pressure to work long hours came from the assumption that long hours were the norm, and these assumptions came from both within and outside the workplace. So when I interviewed the workers, many of them spoke of these exceptional individuals who worked late into the night. And these, I would think, individuals are the Stacknovites. These are the individuals that bind the image of the high-tech workplace with that of the long hours worker. And those are the individuals that are the object of journalistic articles and popular commentary. So there's an example, there's a very popular book called The Nudist on the Night Shift, which is about Silicon Valley. And in it, the author describes this programmer who works late at night, and because he's a nudist, he works he works naked. And that story of this individual, that's the title of the book. So it frames the whole book about the story of Silicon Valley. But it doesn't tell you the story. He's on his own. There's not other workers who are also, uncomfortable because he's nude with them. But you don't hear their stories, the stories of the workers who've left the nudist on his own on the night shift. Okay, so long hours aren't a universal experience. That doesn't say there aren't universal experiences. And there's two other aspects of working time that were shared. Firstly, there was the expectation that long hours were the norm when they weren't. And what I found is that people had very different understandings of what normal hours were. One of the workers I interviewed felt that his 50 hours a week was evidence of bad planning by his managers, so it wasn't normal, while another felt that his 40 hours a week was within the definition of a properly run company and hence acceptable. So there were very fluid and very personal and very variable understandings of working time. This wasn't like 9 to 5 like the movie. This was, we think everyone's working quite long hours. But the second thing that was universally shared was the experience that hours could and would occasionally be extended to non-work time. So for some it's long hours, but for all it's emergency work time. By emergency work time, I mean that non-work time was reconfigured to become working time, a working time that was unpredictable, irregular, and occasional. So
How long in advance does it have to be predictable?
What?
How long in advance do you have to have notice for it to be predictable?
Well, that's quite a good question. There is a survey question in the European Working Time Survey that asks you what notice do you have when the shift change, and they say I think it's a week or the day before or the day of. I think are the different options. But I mean, like when you do research on working time, you find that's an interesting question, but you also find yourself asking the question, well, what are long hours? And what are short hours? When you say long hours worker, what are you talking about? And you realise those are actually normative questions about what you consider to be acceptable working time and unacceptable. Where are you coming from with asking the question?
Well, you just said they were unpredictable, so I was wondering what your definition of unpredictable was.
Oh, right, okay. Well, that's, very little notice. Not regular. Not something you could predict that was going to happen in a weekly or a routine, non-routine. So I then moved on to look at what was it about the working process itself that would make working time unpredictable. And I looked at the labour process and the economy of the software worker. In the high-tech workplaces, work time and non-work time intertwine, and there's a great variation in the time taken for tasks to be completed. That allows new tasks to be slotted in while waiting for another. Knowledge acquisition is not something that's encapsulated and delivered in particular places at a specific time, but something that permeates the whole working day. So people talked about mail in particular as something that filtered in and being in the background. An email was seen as something that was work, but it wasn't work. It was something that was getting in the way of you doing work, but obviously it was work because the workplaces are very connected, so they depend on email to organise the labour process. The project itself could often be a movable feast. The precise specifications that could change over time. So refining production plans would involve meetings, conversations, arguments and debate. And the time taken to listen and to persuade was a very nebulous type of time, and yet without taking this time, the content of the work would fluctuate widely. So like email, people also spoke about meetings as a sort of time that they felt was grey time, irritating time, getting in the way of them actually doing the work. But if you looked at the work, you realised that they actually had to go to the meetings because that's where they came to agreement about the specification of whatever they were building was. So knowledge work consists both of the scattered time of interruptions and the time of flow, the absorbed flow of learning. And when software workers think about work, often they're thinking about the absorbed flow of working and not the scattered time of interruptions. And there was a very interesting study where in order to facilitate more of the time of flow, a sociologist who did a bit of research suggested to a company that what they would do is have 2-hour segments where nobody could be interrupted. And they did that, and everybody thought it was brilliant, it was really great, but over time it collapsed and people went back to interrupting. And that's because interruptions are also necessary, because that's how you get an answer quickly to your question, that's how you learn about your product. And, you know, it's not a solitary job, it's also a very networked job. So all these different times are not directly measurable, and it's very difficult to predict how long it will take to learn from a colleague, to share information, to answer your emails, or even to schedule a meeting. My own timescales are unpredictable, but the work is very cooperative. So as well as, I mean, there's a lot of time management software and web pages and guides to time management, and they all have a great difficulty because they can give me great advice of how I can manage my time. But if I'm working in a networked organisation, depending on the time and management of how do I manage other people's times? What if our times are in conflict? So my dependency, there are dependencies associated with working with others who are juggling their own bundle of unpredictable tasks, and that adds another layer of unpredictability into the mix. So knowledge workplace is more like a dish of spaghetti. It's very difficult to discern where one sort of time begins and another ends. This results in frustrated Facebook updates like the following. Beginning to doubt that there's any job out there where we're actually allowed to do one goddamn thing at a time, or even finish an effing task before you take on 50 more. This dislike of my new job is really settling in fast. I suspect that's something that many in this room have also experienced, this idea of having multiple demands. But this messy spaghetti time of work, that has to operate within a very linear type of time. I talked about clock time earlier, a very linear sort of time of deadlines, market releases and quarterly reports. So as a result, within the workplaces, we have a working culture in which the time of work blends very effortlessly into the time of home in such a way that's very difficult to distinguish the two types of time. Usually people talk about that in terms of work happening outside working hours, so it's blending from work into non-work. But it can happen the other way around. You could be in your workplace doing home stuff, or you could be in your workplace writing on a pet project that has nothing to do with your paid employer. Might actually become your work in 5 or 10 years when you leave your employer and you set up your own business. So the times of work are very unclear. So then I moved and I tried to look at the strategies that people use to control these blurred boundaries. And I found that the temporal bargains had to be continually negotiated, and this negotiation occurred in private and not in public. So I'll just give you 2 examples of this. One is negotiations around time off in lieu. So in many cases, time off in lieu was offered, but on an informal basis. So this is if you worked late, you might be able to take some time off later on. It wasn't a right automatically available to employees. Rather, it was a concession that had to be asked for. And different standards applied within the same company. So within the same company, some developers received time in lieu for working weekends and others didn't. I looked at the example of working on New Year's Eve, and this programmer, I'm just going to give you a quote from the program, is talking about working New Year's Eve. He says about his team, they were in all night. They did it just to show their loyalty at any opportunity they jumped at it. So my boss went to work at 8 p.m. the night before and he stayed till 8 a.m. They had to buy us all into coming into work that morning. There's rarely any industrial relations issues at work, but it was the one thing where people said, I really won't do it for that much money. I'd agreed days off. I felt they didn't have to come up with a big number to pay me because I had a few days off. I think one person might have negotiated something similar, but everybody else was strong-armed into it. So you can see there's pressures on the programmers. In order to prove their loyalty, they have to come in and work New Year's Eve. But the loyalty has limits, and they want to be paid for a recognition that it's anti-social working hours. They want to put a price on the non-work time. And monetary recognition on the fact that the time didn't automatically belong to the company, but was something that had to be fought for. So Joe goes on and tells me about the experience of a young programmer who had just joined the company. They said to him, you really don't have to do it, and it really wasn't true. He did really have to do it. You don't want to get into conflict. And he should have said something like, I'd love to, but I've got this big family commitment already. I just can't get out of it. I'd really like to. Not like, I'm not doing it, and then allow himself to be bought out of it. So what this shows is that those newer to the industry are more susceptible to the pressure. Joe negotiates his own time off in secret, and he advises programmers to use deception as a strategy for resisting the company demands. In both instances, the public definition of non-work time remains unchallenged. One developer explained that time in lieu could be received as long as one was discreet about it. Evidence of how successful that discretion was found when I had a conversation with another programmer, a woman programmer in the same company, and her understanding was that the company did not give time off in lieu of weekends worked. So the secrecy and the hidden nature of these agreements indicates that while the company will capitulate under pressure, it will not publicly alter its definition of emergency time, as for example as the weekend is a flexible extension of the working week. A second example can be found if we look at people who bring their work home in the evenings. Very few programmers actually worked at home outside office hours. I asked Dermot when he was very busy in multiple projects, did he bring his work home with him, and he said, I bring it home with me and I leave it in my bag. So, like many workers, he found his thoughts were occupied outside work by his work problems. So he said, I think about it in bed when I go to sleep. I don't know, maybe it helps you, maybe you come to some decisions subconsciously. I would very rarely bring home work and sit down at a desk and do it. So he uses phrases like dream and subconscious, which indicates he feels very little control over work thoughts leaking into home time. I asked him why he didn't open his bag, and he answered, well, once you're home, out of sight, out of mind. Well, I bring home a bag every day. I do it more for show now than anything else, but I bring home my diary, my big A4 diary, every day. So by bringing home, and I think it's ironic it's a diary, by bringing home his briefcase, he signals that he intends to work. He's publicly dissolving the boundaries between work and non-work, yet the briefcase remains unopened. Privately, boundaries are maintained, and work is kept separate from the non-work sphere. In a recent paper, I think the paper published last year in Organisational Science, Erin Reid similarly reported that she found 3 types of behaviour when looking at a consultancy firm. This was a firm similar to the ones I was looking at, in which non-work time was seen as emergency work time, a firm where crisis situations within teams was very common. And she described the 3 types of behaviour she saw evidence on behalf of the employees. You had embracing, those who accepted this level of commitment, that this level of commitment was required and made themselves available to the company, who were always willing. You had passing, those who gave a public commitment but privately avoided work burdens. And then you had revealing, those who publicly negotiated their working conditions to avoid emergency time. So usefully, she was also able to analyse performance evaluations, and she discovered that passing resulted in similar valuations as embracing, while those who adopted revealing strategies, those people who had actually negotiated shorter working hours, up front received significantly poorer performance evaluations. I think that's a very interesting finding, because it's always been assumed that it's visibility that's important in the workplace, that you prove your loyalty by being visible. But I think when you see that presence it's not just presence that's being rewarded, but also a commitment to a temporal culture, a temporal hegemony, an ideology of working time. And this is an ideology that's very resistant to family-friendly policies. Perlow and Hochschild, looking at similar US workplaces, found resistances to part-time work, job sharing, or teleworking. In February 2013, Yahoo CEO Marissa Mayer issued a very unpopular directive forbidding remote working or teleworking for Yahoo employees. In 2014, Google, in Dublin actually, reported had a trial program where they encouraged employees to leave their mobile phone devices in the office when they left work. And they reported blissful, stressless evenings. But despite the popularity of this program, the trial wasn't extended. So to move on to look at problems, the problems inherent to working hours are very similar to those raised by long working hours. Chiefly, it's an encroachment of work time into non-work time. Flexibility, which is often seen as a family-friendly feature of the workplace, can also be a trap if it makes non-working time available to the company. And if it's unpredictable, it makes the organisation of non-working time very problematic, particularly if you've got caring responsibilities, such as people looking after children, elderly parents, or sick relatives. So although many of the people I interviewed expressed the desire to work fewer hours, only 2 had actually managed to alter their working hours. In Ireland, less than 1 in 10 software workers works part-time, by which I mean less than 3 to 5 hours a week. And as with the workers I interviewed, this figure is heavily gendered. Almost 2/3 of those workers are women. So the women who were working part-time felt that this was granted only because they had sympathetic line managers who were willing to accede to their requests. James Wickham and his colleagues found similar experiences in other private professional companies. One woman explained to him, "I'm lucky to have my direct boss who is very good, he looks after me, he's very sympathetic, helpful and flexible. Above him, it can be difficult to measure work, above him and around him, if I were anybody else, I wouldn't get that flexibility." So again, you've got very individualised working time. You've got oppositions that don't challenge the dominant culture, that leave this culture of emergency working time unchallenged. Working time is contested, fluid and flexible, but it's contested in secret. And negotiations conducted on an individual basis almost by definition ensure that altered working conditions are only ever available to the few. So within the study, workers, even in the same workplaces, different workers were under different time regimes. So particular individuals will always be disadvantaged: the immigrant who's dependent on the employer's visa, the younger, unexperienced workers. Those women who negotiated part-time work as they began their families were faced with the challenge of progressing within a culture which put a high premium on corporate loyalty, which was measured in the willingness to accept emergency time. These factors perhaps underscore why there have been limitations on how far working arrangements have been modified. As I said at the very beginning, these are employees that have very high levels of autonomy over their working hours. If you have high levels of autonomy and your work is by its nature unpredictable with long hours, why would you balance that by having some very short hours at times? And this wasn't found. So there are problems with unpredictable work. It can be very difficult to measure working time, which is occasional rather than regular, exceptional rather than normal. This gives it difficult for employees to understand what is normal, and they have a skewed understanding of it. Furthermore, the fixed structure of working time in industrial society was much more conducive to setting up working time standards which applied to all than the fluid temporal practices. You have an increased individualization of working time, An additional problem is that when you have additional demands in your working time, those demands occur at different times for different groups of individuals, such that long hours, when they do occur, are not necessarily felt uniformly by the whole workplace. So it's different, say, for example, if you're working in the service sector, you know Christmas is coming up, you know everybody's going to be working long hours. If you're working in an IT job, your segment of the work process may be under pressure to deliver. That segment isn't. So you may be working long hours, but that person isn't, which makes it hard to have enterprise-wide responses to such pressures. So what we might do in that situation? What alternatives might there be? There's lots of literature documenting the negative effect of long hours. And if the problem was simply long hours, the approach would be to reduce national limits on working hours. But if we look at the French example, in which the 35-hour working week was introduced nationally, we find that the majority, between 2000 and 2005, we find that although the majority reported an increased quality of life, their working conditions had disimproved, with many complaining of work intensification and, interestingly, increased irregular and unpredictable schedules. So working hour reduction actually created more unpredictability. Another approach would be just to say we accept emergency working time, it's a reasonable trade-off for greater temporal autonomy and job satisfaction. So as a stockbroker interviewed by Mary Blair Lowe said, I would overall say it's a wonderful way to make a living. Your time is your own, you can come and go as you please, you don't have anyone telling you what to do. It's a fantastic, relaxed business in that regard. However, the same study also showed that this temporal autonomy led to increased work-life conflict. If, as it's been suggested, predictability is more important than flexibility in terms of satisfaction with work-life balance, then the solution surely is to impose routine and to return to standardised time. In a wider sense, the destandardisation of working time creates tensions at a societal level. Where social timetables are fragmented, scheduling is a key problem. There's a very interesting paper by Dale Sullivan in which she looks at the challenges that are created by coordinating social life within an increasingly uncoordinated society. And he looked at families that were experiencing a sense of rush or time squeeze or harriedness. And in order to schedule time together, these families were designating certain times, usually Sundays, as a period of time that was dedicated solely to social relationships. So they created boundaries around the special family time, but the protection of these boundaries around that time had the unintended consequences of creating feelings of pressure in all the other days. So to keep one time free, all other working commitments have to be squeezed into the remaining time. Yet, if you don't do that, if you don't dedicate one day to social life, it becomes extremely difficult to find a shared time to meet, as the diverse schedules of family and friends are not aligned to each other. So the imposition of personal routines can create tensions where there is a conflict within the dominant working culture. I'm sure all of you have the experience of trying to arrange with a group of 5 to 7 friends a night you're all available, and it's becoming increasingly difficult, and that's why you have software like Doodle to allow people to arrange when they can all meet. So is it possible to return to shorter national limits? Certainly a move would probably be in opposition to European policy and Irish national policy. It wouldn't be necessarily welcomed by a workforce that prefers to have control over its working hours or makes sense in terms of working processes which are unpredictable. With so many processes driving unpredictability, it's very difficult to envisage a return to routine. A final option would be to allow the rhythms of the work processes and the workers to determine working time arrangements. So if we got rid of the deadlines set by financial reports, by going to market, if we had deadlines that include all the intangible times of work, all the meetings and the email and the discussions and the interruptions, if we had a deadline that was set by the work process. One author suggests that in this case, labour processes would be collaboratively self-organised, and that might allow workers to build on their experiences and plan for reasonable estimates of project time, estimates that are not built on expectations of emergency time, and estimates that are allowed for inevitable unpredictability. estimates that allow, as one programmer told him, everyone to work at his own pace. A work discipline that measured productivity by when workers are present might not hold anymore. Instead, working time would allow the ebb and flow of knowledge work, with periods of greater intensity or longer hours, followed by periods of less work and working time. However, when I did the research, I found that autonomy in schedule setting led to long, porous hours, by which I mean is the hours were long, but you weren't necessarily at work. This is quite common in the US. They have very long working hours, but in their working hours they'll go to the gym, or they'll do the laundry, or they'll do their online shopping. So even though the hours are long, they're quite porous with times of non-work within the working day. So we would see that some aspect of routine would be necessary if one didn't want the days to stretch. And finally, I think it's maybe useful for us to reflect about us as knowledge workers and how much of this we have ourselves experienced. On Saturday, I got an email from a journal asking me was I be willing to review a journal article. I didn't reply to it because it was a Saturday and I wasn't working. And then on Monday, which is a bank holiday, ironically the May Day bank holiday, I got a follow-up email asking me why I hadn't replied to Saturday's email. So I think that's a really lovely example of emergency work time within the academic labour process. That's it.